The small diner nestled in the corner of a busy street, where the pale yellow glow from old ceiling lamps cast patches of shadow and light in a hazy dance. The clinking of dishes blended with the loud chatter of customers, punctuated by the hiss of an ancient coffee machine. Clara, a 25-year-old woman with brown hair neatly tied up, weaved her way past the crowded tables, the tray in her hand trembling slightly with each step. The white uniform shirt, frayed at the cuffs, did nothing to hide the rough scar on her left arm, a long, uneven line, like a clumsy sculpture carved by fate. The dim light fell on the scar, making it stand out as a silent challenge, drawing every curious gaze. "What happened to her arm? That's disgusting." A middle-aged woman with shiny dyed blonde hair whispered to her companion, her eyes flicking over Clara as if she were some odd object in a shop window. "Gives me goosebumps just looking," the other woman replied, not bothering to hide her contempt. Those words, though familiar, still stabbed into Clara's heart like tiny needles. She paused for a second, took a deep breath, and felt the familiar ache rising in her chest. But then she let out a mischievous smile, her eyes gleaming as if she had just thought up a joke. "Oh, ma'am, this is my trophy from the time I wrestled a wild cat. Obviously, I lost," she quipped, her voice light but laced with humor, making the woman flush and quickly look away. Inside, Clara's heart was like a suppressed ocean, waves crashing violently beneath an unbroken surface. That night, as the clock struck 10, the diner door swung open, revealing the tall figure of Adrian Cole. He stepped inside, clad in a charcoal gray suit that hugged his frame, exuding the elegance of a man more accustomed to boardrooms than a modest diner like this. But his eyes sharp, deep, as if always searching for something, made him stand out in the crowd. Clara glanced at him as he chose a small table by the window, but she quickly looked away, continuing her work with practiced rhythm. At a corner table, a group of young customers with garishly dyed hair laughed boisterously. One of them, his face red from too many beers, suddenly pointed at Clara as she brought over a tray of coffee. "Hey girl, what's up with your arm? Looks like a road map. My kid could doodle better than that," he bellowed, and his friends burst into laughter, their voices striking the air like hammers. Clara stopped, her hand tightening around the tray, but the smile on her lips didn't waver. Tilting her head, she pretended to think before answering coolly, "Oh, buddy, this is exclusive artwork limited edition. If you want a scar like mine, there's quite a long waiting list." The whole table roared with laughter again, but this time it was at her wit. Clara quietly wiped away the splash of coffee the man had deliberately spilled on her arm. The hot liquid seeped into the scar, but she didn't make a sound. From his table, Adrian watched it all. His brows drew together, a flicker of anger in his eyes. He stood abruptly, walking toward the group with an air of authority. "That's enough," he said, his voice cold as ice, every word etched from stone. "Apologize to her. Now." The space around the table fell instantly silent. The young man shifted awkwardly, muttering a half-hearted apology before turning away. Clara looked up, meeting Adrian's gaze. Her brown eyes shone with a steady resolve. No trace of weakness, mingled with a hint of curiosity. "Thank you," she said evenly, her tone touched with dry humor. "But I'm used to these little art critiques. They don't define me." Then she turned away, her hair swaying lightly, leaving Adrian standing there, his heart stirring at the strength and sharpness of this small woman. When Clara brought his coffee to the table, the dim light slipped across her wrist, revealing a small swallow-shaped birthmark hidden beneath the scar. For just an instant, Adrian felt frozen, his breath caught, the pen in his hand hovering midair. That birthmark, it was exactly as Nathaniel Grant, his friend, his benefactor, his closest business partner had described during countless nights of pain, speaking of the daughter he had lost. "She has a little swallow-shaped birthmark on her left wrist," Nathaniel had once said, his voice cracking, eyes red with regret. For 20 years, Nathaniel had lived haunted, searching for Lillian, the daughter who vanished after the tragic accident that took his wife. Adrian stared at Clara, now standing behind the counter, slowly drying glasses. She smiled at a coworker, but even in the light in her eyes, there was a sadness that couldn't be grasped. His heart surged as if a door to the past had just swung open. Could she be Lillian? Had fate truly brought him here, to this very moment? He clenched his hand, his heart pounding, caught between hope and the fear that he might be wrong. But deep in his soul, a voice whispered, he had to find out the truth no matter where it led. You're watching Soul Stories, where every story whispers of love, healing, and hope. Let us know which city you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our journey. Now stay with us. The story is just beginning. Adrian's penthouse occupied the top floor of a skyscraper, where the city lights stretched out like a glittering carpet beneath the pitch-black night sky. In his private office, the glow from an old brass desk lamp spilled across mahogany bookshelves lined with neatly arranged documents and contracts. He had just returned home and now sat in a leather chair, his suit jacket removed and draped carelessly over the back. He took a sip of whiskey, his gaze distant, as though he were drifting into a corner of memory he had tried for years to bury. The glass in his hand trembled, catching the light, but his mind was no longer here. It was, with the small girl bearing the large scar and the swallow-shaped birthmark. His thoughts were drifting back years to the man who had changed his life. Nathaniel Grant, his friend, his mentor, his benefactor, rose in his mind like a figure that could never be erased. Nathaniel had not only been his business partner, but also the man who reached out and pulled Adrian from those reckless days when he'd been nothing but a young man, full of ambition but lacking direction. The loans, the sharp advice, and all those long nights by the fireplace where Nathaniel shared his life in a deep, warm voice, those things had shaped Adrian into the man he was now. He owed the older man not just his career, but also his faith in himself. But the memory tonight wasn't about those better days. It was heavier, more painful. Adrian closed his eyes, and like an old film reel, he saw Nathaniel again sitting in the grand living room of the Grant estate 2 years ago. His eyes were red, his face gaunt, his trembling hands clutching a worn family photo. She has a little swallow-shaped birthmark on her left wrist, Nathaniel had said, his voice splintering like shattered glass. He had spoken of that fateful day, the accident that had stolen his wife, Margaret, and his little daughter, Lillian, who had been only 4. But what Nathaniel could never forgive himself for was his own doubt. He had been jealous, convinced Margaret was unfaithful, and in his rage he had driven her away. Her car had plunged off the cliff and burst into flames in the rain-soaked night. Margaret had died, but Lillian had vanished, and since that moment, Nathaniel had lived inside a prison of regret. I am the man who destroyed my family, who sent my wife to her death and lost my daughter, he had whispered once, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. For 20 years, Nathaniel had never stopped searching for Lillian. He had hired detectives, chased down every lead, but they had all ended in dead ends. Now, with his health failing and illness eating away at him day by day, Nathaniel had turned to Adrian, his eyes full of despair. You're my last hope, he'd said, his voice weak but urgent. I believe Lillian is still alive. Please find her for me. I can't die without seeing my daughter again. Adrian had promised, even though he knew the clues were as fragile as a candle flickering in a storm. Nathaniel had shown him the photograph of the little girl and the only identifying mark he could still remember, the swallow-shaped birthmark, a detail that seemed almost like a luxury dream. But tonight, the image of Clara eclipsed every other memory. Adrian set the whiskey glass down, his hand unconsciously gripping the arm of the chair. The girl in the small diner with her brown hair tied up, her steady eyes and the smile that concealed her pain was as vivid as a living portrait. He remembered the way she had responded to the jeers, her tone wry but unable to fully hide the cracks in her spirit. And then, the swallow-shaped birthmark on her wrist, half hidden beneath the rough scar, like a whisper from the past. Could fate have led him to that diner at precisely that moment? Or was it nothing more than a cruel coincidence? Adrian rose and walked to the large window, looking down at the city awash in light. His heart thudded, a strange mixture of hope and fear surging through him. If Clara was Lillian, it would change everything for Nathaniel, for her, and for himself. But if he was wrong, if this was only an illusion, he would be throwing Nathaniel back into another pit of despair. He clenched his hands so tightly that his nails bit into his palms, as if to keep himself from being swept away by the storm of emotion. Clara's image surfaced again, her mischievous smile, her resolute eyes and the small birthmark like a promise left unfulfilled. He turned back to the desk, opened his laptop, and his fingers flew across the keys. He needed to know more about Clara, her past, where she had grown up, anything that could confirm the truth. With each heartbeat urging him forward, he knew he had to act. He had to find the truth. Even though his heart trembled with fear, Adrian knew he couldn't stop, not only because of his promise to Nathaniel, but because of the look in Clara's eyes, the look of a woman who had survived storms he couldn't even imagine, and still chosen to smile. Dusk settled in, the golden-orange light of sunset washing over the narrow street leading to the orphanage, where the old concrete walls were covered with childish drawings. Clear, innocent laughter echoed from the playground, where Clara sat on a battered wooden bench, surrounded by children with bright, eager eyes. She was telling a story, her voice lively, tinged with humor. And then the dragon breathed fire, but it missed and hit the tree instead, so the whole forest turned into toast. The children burst into laughter, clutching their bellies, a few of them jumping around to imitate the clumsy dragon. Clara laughed along with them, but Adrian, standing quietly under the shade of an old tree nearby, saw the deep sadness hidden in her brown eyes. Clara's smile was as radiant as the sun, but her gaze looked like a lone lantern, stubbornly shining against a cold wind. Adrian had been watching Clara for days now, not out of suspicion, but because of an inexplicable pull. He stood there, dressed in the rare simplicity of a shirt instead of a suit, hands in his pockets, observing her every move. Outside her hours at the diner, Clara spent nearly all her time here with the children. She mended a little girl's torn dress, taught a boy how to tie his shoelaces, and patiently listened to their rambling stories. Once, a small child hugged her tightly and whispered, "Clara, you won't leave us, will you?" Clara knelt down, gently stroking the child's hair, her voice soft. "I promise. I'll be here for a long, long time." But when she turned away, Adrian saw her bite her lip, her eyes clouding over as if she were holding back a wave of emotion. He wondered, what made a young woman, with the whole world ahead of her, choose to stay here among these broken lives, as if she were searching for herself in their eyes? That night after the diner closed, Clara stood behind the counter, cleaning the last of the glasses under the dim yellow light. The old radio played scratchy jazz tunes, mingling with the distant sounds of traffic outside. Adrian walked in, this time not heading to his usual table but straight to the counter. Clara looked up, that familiar smile curving her lips, though her eyes glimmered with a hint of wariness. "Black coffee, no sugar, right?" she asked, her movements quick and practiced. Adrian shook his head, sitting on the tall stool in front of her, his gaze fixed on her face. "I'd like to talk for a moment, if that's all right," he said, his voice low and cautious. Clara raised an eyebrow, setting the glass down and crossing her arms. "About what? If this is about the coffee incident the other day, I already told you I'm fine." Her tone was light, even teasing, but Adrian could feel the defense hidden behind her smile. He took a breath, weighing every word. "Clara, I don't want to intrude on your private life, but have you ever thought about your past? About your family?" The question made her smile falter. She let out a laugh, but it was dry, tinged with bitterness. "My past? Oh, buddy, I grew up in an orphanage. That's the short version. No drama there." She turned away, continuing to wipe the glass, but her hand trembled slightly, making the glass clink against the counter. Adrian looked at her, his heart heavy. He knew he was stepping into forbidden territory, but the image of that swallow-shaped birthmark wouldn't leave his mind. "Clara," he said more gently, "I just want to help. There are things that might be connected to you. A DNA test could clear everything up." The air fell silent. Clara stopped moving, her brown eyes darkening, her gaze turning sharp as a blade. "What did you say?" Her voice quivered not with fear, but with an anger rising from deep within. "You think I'm some object to be tested? A specimen for you to analyze?" She threw the dish towel onto the counter, bracing her hands on her hips, her eyes blazing. I don't need anyone to define who I am. Do you understand? Before he could answer, she turned on her heel, striding into the back, the door slamming shut behind her with a heavy thud. Adrian stood frozen, feeling as though he'd been slapped. He didn't blame her. Her anger was justified, but it also made him realize just how much hurt she carried. He left the diner, walking under the dim streetlights, his heart burdened by one question: how do you convince someone who doesn't want to be saved? Meanwhile, in her cramped, rented room, Clara sat on the worn-out bed, the glow from a street lamp seeping weakly through the thin curtain. She looked down at the scar on her arm, her finger unconsciously tracing the tiny swallow-shaped birthmark. Adrian's words echoed in her mind like a stone thrown into a still pond. Who am I? She whispered the question into the darkness, her voice cracking. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, hot against her skin, falling onto her arm. She had lived her whole life without needing to know the answer, but now the question felt like a smoldering fire, burning through the defenses she had built. Clara wiped her tears quickly, taking a deep, unsteady breath. Just once, she murmured, as if trying to convince herself, just to prove him wrong. But deep inside, a tiny flicker of hope sparked to life. Hope for a past she had never dared to dream about. Morning light streamed through the silk curtains of Adrian's office, falling across the DNA test report lying silently on the mahogany desk. The dry numbers and charts on that page carried the weight of destiny. Clara was indeed Lillian Grant, Nathaniel's long-lost daughter. Adrian held the paper, his fingers clutching it so tightly the edges crumpled, his heart pounding like a war drum. 20 years of searching, the countless nights Nathaniel had sat by the fireplace, with his head bowed, his voice breaking as he spoke of his missing child. And the unyielding light in Clara's eyes, all of it converged into this truth that filled Adrian with both hope and dread. He knew this news wasn't just an answer, it was a storm that could either destroy Nathaniel or save him. How could he speak the words, knowing each might be a knife or a lifeline? Adrian drove to the Grant estate, his heart heavy as though he were carrying the weight of the world. The old mansion rose among the shaded gardens, ivy clinging to the stone walls as if to guard the secrets of the past. Nathaniel sat in the vast living room, a thin wool cardigan draped over his frail body, his trembling hands clutching a worn photograph. In the picture, Margaret smiled gently while little Lillian hugged a doll, the swallow-shaped birthmark peeking from her wrist. Adrian entered, the test report in his hand, feeling as heavy as lead. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice, though his chest felt like it was being crushed. Nathaniel, Adrian began, his voice low and careful, as if stepping onto thin ice. The old man looked up, his eyes red and clouded by illness and decades of sorrow. I need you to stay calm. I have important news. Nathaniel frowned, his hand gripping the photograph tighter, as if he already sensed what was coming. Adrian knelt in front of him, his gaze never leaving his friend's worn face. I found her, Nathaniel. Clara, she is Lillian. The DNA test confirmed it. Your daughter is alive. It felt as if the world shattered into pieces. Nathaniel collapsed back into the chair, the photograph slipping from his hand and landing on the floor with a soft rustle. Lillian, alive? He whispered, his voice trembling like wind passing through brittle branches. Then, as if a dam broke, tears streamed down his lined cheeks, soaking into his cardigan. He covered his face, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, equal parts overwhelming joy and bottomless regret. She's alive. My God, she's alive, he repeated over and over, as if trying to convince himself it was real. But then his eyes dimmed, filling with guilt. I don't deserve this. I destroyed her family. Margaret. Lillian. His voice cracked apart, merging with wrenching sobs that seemed to tear from the depths of his chest. Adrian gripped his shoulder, his own voice shaking despite his effort to stay calm. Nathaniel, listen to me. Lillian is alive and she's here within your reach. Don't let the past steal this moment. But Nathaniel didn't seem to hear him. He slumped back, gasping for breath, his hands pressed over his chest as if his heart couldn't bear the surge of emotion. Panicked, Adrian called for the housekeeper to bring water and medicine, silently praying the old man would survive the shock. After several long minutes, Nathaniel slowly regained some composure, though his eyes remained unfocused, as if he were trapped somewhere between joy and pain, too vast to reconcile. Bringing Clara to the Grant estate proved to be another test altogether. After much persuading, she agreed, but every step she took up the gravel path to that vast house felt like dragging an invisible boulder behind her. Clara stood in front of the tall iron gates, her hands clasped so tightly her nails dug into her palms. The dark blue sweater she wore did nothing to hide the scar on her left arm, and the wan sunlight fell on it like a reminder of all the years she lived without a name, without a family. Her heart raced, each beat a question. Do I belong here? Who am I really? She bit her lip, trying to hold back the rising tide of thoughts, but her brown eyes were already shining with fear, mingled with longing. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and Nathaniel appeared, leaning on his cane, his frail figure like a ghost in the dim light. His eyes brightened when he saw her, but the brightness was quickly shadowed by a deep sorrow, as if he were seeing all his guilt made flesh. "Lillian!" he called out, his voice cracked and thin as a plea. Clara stood frozen, her feet rooted to the marble floor. She looked at the man before her, not the father from her vague childhood dreams, but an old man with a lined face and trembling hands that reached out but dared not touch her. In his eyes she saw a fierce love, but also guilt and terror. Terror that she would turn away, the way he once lost her mother. "Lillian, it's you, isn't it?" Nathaniel repeated, taking one shaky step forward, his cane tapping the floor with a hollow clack. Clara instinctively stepped back, her heart tearing in two. Part of her ached to run to him, to wrap her arms around him and finally speak the word, father. But a bigger part, the part that had grown up in orphanages, through long, lonely nights and scars, both seen and unseen, held her in place. She saw not just a father, but an entire past she wasn't ready to face. "I need time," she whispered, her voice raw, every word dragged out from deep in her chest. Tears welled up, but she bit her lip so hard she tasted blood, then turned and hurried out, leaving Nathaniel standing alone in the vast living room. Nathaniel sank into a chair, clutching the old photograph again as tears fell silently, soaking the yellowed edges. "She looks so much like Margaret," he murmured, his voice lost in the hush of wordless pain. Adrian stood beside him, his heart unbearably heavy. He watched Clara's silhouette disappear beyond the gates and realized this truth was not just a miracle, it was also a fresh wound for both Clara and Nathaniel. That young woman, no matter how strong she appeared, was carrying a hollow place no one could fill not yet. Still following the story? If this story found you outside of Soul Stories, we invite you home to where every touching tale begins with truth, hope, and heart. The news that Clara was Lillian Grant, the long-lost daughter of the Grant family, spread like wildfire, shaking the cold hallways of the Grant mansion. The ancient house, with its moss-covered stone walls and towering windows, had become the epicenter of dark schemes. The relatives who had long set their sights on Nathaniel's immense fortune now looked at Clara as a threat they could not tolerate. In the hidden corners of the mansion, they whispered wicked plans to each other, their voices hissing like cold wind, slipping through cracks in the stone. In a closed room, the crystal chandelier cast its glow over Evelyn's sharp, elegant face. She was Nathaniel's cousin, her platinum hair styled into elaborate waves that shimmered under the light, though her eyes were as cold and cutting as a blade. "She's a fraud," Evelyn spat, swirling her glass of red wine, her gaze sweeping over the relatives seated around the walnut table. "Some orphan girl daring to claim she's Lillian Grant? We cannot let her steal this family's inheritance." Nods of agreement followed, their eyes glinting with greed. They began plotting to manipulate public opinion, to smear the DNA results as falsified, to paint Clara as a gold digger impersonating Lillian to seize wealth. An anonymous envelope stuffed with expertly forged documents was sent to the family's law firm, along with vicious rumors seeded in the tabloid stories depicting Clara as a cunning opportunist. Nathaniel, his health deteriorating by the day, knew nothing of this conspiracy. He spent his days in the upstairs bedroom, his frail body sunken into a velvet armchair, trembling hands clinging to the old photo of Margaret and little Lillian. His eyes, clouded by illness, still brightened whenever he thought of Clara, the daughter he had found again after 20 years. But the disease consuming him left him powerless, his mind drifting back to the days he had lost. "Lillian, will you ever forgive me?" he whispered, his voice breaking in the stillness, like a prayer no one would ever hear. Adrian discovered the plot when a friend in the legal field called, urgency in his voice. An anonymous envelope came in accusing Clara of fraud, saying she faked the DNA to steal the inheritance. "Be careful, Adrian, this is serious." In his office, the lamplight fell across Adrian's tense face, his hands gripping the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. Rage burned in his chest, not just at the cruelty of the Grant family, but at their audacity to slander Clara, the woman who had survived so much pain and still managed to smile. He remembered the resolute look in her eyes at the diner, the way she had met ridicule with humor, and the moment she stood before Nathaniel, her gaze conflicted but never weak. "They won't be allowed to hurt her," he murmured, his voice low and determined. Adrian immediately contacted his legal team, ordering them to track down the source of the forgeries and determined to expose the scheme before it could do more harm. Meanwhile, Clara began to feel the pressure pressing down on her like an invisible boulder. She hadn't set foot in the Grant mansion since meeting Nathaniel. She had no interest in fighting over inheritance, but the cruel rumors found their way to her like crashing waves. One morning, as she prepared coffee at the diner, a regular held up a tabloid and sneered, "Clara, you're famous now. Says here you're a con artist pretending to be the Grant heir to grab the money." Clara froze, her hand trembling so badly the coffee nearly slipped from her grip. But she quickly regained her composure, flashing her mischievous smile. "Oh, if I were that good at scamming people, I'd be on a yacht in the Caribbean right now instead of making you coffee." She winked, her voice playful enough to make the counter erupt in laughter. But when she turned away, her eyes darkened, her heart twisting like it had been stabbed. That night in her tiny rented room, Clara sat on the rickety bed, hugging the arm with the scar. Her finger traced the small, swallow-shaped birthmark. "Trouble," she murmured, forcing a wry smile. "But I've survived worse days, haven't I?" Even as she tried to sound hopeful, she felt an invisible weight tightening around her chest, as if the past she had just dared to touch was reaching back to pull her under. Adrian refused to let Clara face it alone. He arrived at the diner one drizzling evening, when Clara was wiping down the counter, the dim golden light highlighting her scar and the contemplative look in her eyes. "Clara," he called, his voice low but warm, like a breeze chasing away the cold of the rainy night. She looked up, her trademark mischievous smile rising like a familiar shield. "Black coffee again? Or do you feel adventurous tonight?" Adrian shook his head, stepping closer to the counter, his expression serious but gentle. "I know what's happening, Clara. The rumors, the fake documents, I'm handling it. I won't let them hurt you." Clara looked at him, her smile fading into something softer, rarer, as if the armor she wore was starting to crack. "Thank you, Adrian," she said quietly, her voice small but sincere. "But I'm not the kind of person who needs rescuing. I'm just tired." She shrugged, trying to keep her tone light, but her eyes betrayed an exhaustion she couldn't disguise. Adrian rested his hand on her shoulder, gentle but unwavering, as if he was trying to lend her his strength. "You don't have to pretend to be strong, Clara. Not right now." His words were like warm air slipping through the cracks in her heart. Clara nodded, pressing her lips together to hold back the tears. She wasn't used to being defended, wasn't used to the feeling that someone was truly on her side. But as she met Adrian's steady gaze, she felt a spark of hope flicker to life. Hope that no matter how fierce the storm became, she could stand her ground. Not just for herself, but because, for the first time, she knew she wasn't alone. The dim morning light slipped through the thin hospital curtains, spreading across the cold white walls where the smell of antiseptic mixed with a heavy stillness. The steady beeping of medical machines echoed through the small room, like the heartbeat of an artificial heart, in stark contrast to the frail body of Nathaniel lying on the bed, a faint shadow of the man who had once ruled over the Grant family. The suit he used to wear, radiating power and authority, had been replaced by a thin, wrinkled hospital gown that clung to his withered frame, His sunken cheeks and trembling hands clutched an old photograph, the edges so worn they were nearly torn. It was an image of Margaret, the woman with golden hair and a gentle smile like spring sunlight, beside a 4-year-old girl clutching a doll, her clear eyes and the swallow-shaped birthmark visible on her wrist. That photograph, yellowed with time, was the fragile thread tying Nathaniel to the past and to Clara, the daughter he had just found again, but feared he had already lost forever. Clara stood in the corner of the room, her hands clasped so tightly her nails dug red crescents into her palms. She wore a dark blue sweater, her brown hair tied low, a few loose strands falling across her cheek as if trying to hide the conflicted look in her eyes. The scar on her left arm was visible in the weak light, like a map of the years she had lived without a name, without a family. Her gaze drifted past Nathaniel, finally stopping at the photograph on his chest, her heart twisting. That picture was a fragment of a past she had never known, but also a painful reminder of everything she had lost, and that she now stood face to face with the man who might have caused it all. Outside, the media storm was swallowing her whole, like some invisible beast roaring to consume every flicker of hope she had left. The tabloids, with their bold, sensational headlines, scavenged the old accident like vultures picking a carcass clean. Grant family tragedy, the secret behind the lost daughter, read the massive headline on one paper Clara had seen on the diner counter that morning, left behind by a customer. She had read it in silence, each line like salt rubbed into a wound. They described her mother, Margaret, as a beautiful but unhappy woman who left Nathaniel after a tearful argument, only to meet her fate on a stormy road, rain and thunder tearing the night apart. Little Lillian, age 4, vanished in the accident, the article went on, and now a young woman claiming to be Lillian has appeared. But is it the truth? Clara clenched the newspaper so tightly it crumpled in her hands, her chest tightening until she couldn't breathe. That woman, her mother, was a shadow she had never truly seen, appearing only in fragmented dreams, but each printed word carved a deeper wound she hadn't known she carried. She wanted to rip the paper to shreds, to scream that she was not a liar, but instead she quietly folded it, her hands shaking, and went back to work, as though the world outside wasn't trying to tear her apart. Clara hadn't come to the hospital because she wanted to. She came because of a message from Adrian, short but urgent. Nathaniel needs to see you. He doesn't have much time. She stepped into the room, her legs heavy as if chained to stones, every step dragging her across a threshold into a past she wasn't ready to face. Her eyes avoided Nathaniel's, skimming instead over the details of the room. A vase of wilted white chrysanthemums on the table, the steady beeping of the machines, the sharp smell of antiseptic that made her feel like she couldn't breathe. Nathaniel looked up, his clouded eyes lighting with a fragile flicker of hope when he saw her, but almost immediately, that light faded into deep sorrow, as if he were looking straight at the embodiment of his own guilt. "Lillian," he called, his voice thin and trembling like a dry leaf in a cold wind, every syllable sounding as if it cost him a piece of his last breath. Clara stood still, just a few steps away from the bed, her arms unconsciously wrapping around the scarred arm as if it were her only shield against the rising storm of emotion. Nathaniel tried to sit up, but his body had no strength left. The bed creaked under his frail weight. His trembling hand reached out into the air, as if he wanted to touch her, but knew he had no right. "I need to tell you, I was wrong," he whispered, his voice breaking, each word like a knife he was driving into his own heart. Clara's brow tightened, her heartbeat thudding painfully. She wanted to hear, and she wanted to run from this room, from the truth that was slowly surfacing. Nathaniel drew a ragged breath, his reddened eyes glistening with tears, his voice torn as he spoke. "I doubted your mother, Margaret. I was jealous. I thought she was unfaithful. I drove her away. That night, if it hadn't been for me, you would have had a family." Every word sliced into the past Clara had never known, but somehow felt she had carried her whole life. He paused, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks, soaking into the hospital pillow, leaving stains like confessions that could never be erased. "I'm the one who took everything from you," he whispered, his voice lost in the heavy air, like a man standing on the edge of life and death, begging for a last scrap of forgiveness. Clara fell silent, her feet nailed to the cold floor, her heart splitting open with a pain so deep she could barely breathe. The memories of all the orphaned years flooded in, sharp and vivid as a slow-motion film. She remembered the long nights in the orphanage, curled on a cold iron bed, the thin blanket never enough to chase away the chill in her bones. In her dreams, a mother's arms would reach for her, calling her by a name full of love, golden hair glowing like sunlight. But every time she woke, there was only darkness, and her own small voice whispering questions into the empty room. She remembered standing at the orphanage window, watching other children being led away by parents, their faces bright while she clutched her ragged doll, wondering why no one ever came for her. Now hearing Nathaniel's words, the image of her mother in those dreams felt more real, a woman with a tender smile, but also a hidden sorrow, pushed into tragedy by the man lying before her. Clara felt a searing ache, as if someone were tearing her heart out, piece by piece. She wanted to hate him, to scream that he had stolen everything: her mother, her family, the years she should have been loved. The hatred that had always smoldered inside her, like a small flame on lonely nights, now flared up, hot and consuming. But when she looked at Nathaniel so frail, his eyes red with regret, his hand trembling in the space between them, that hatred dissolved, like fog in the sun. In its place came a nameless compassion, a wave of sorrow so strong it left her breathless. He wasn't the father from her childhood dreams, nor the hero she had once imagined would rescue her from the orphanage. He was only a broken man, imprisoned in his own remorse, now begging her for one last moment of light to leave this world in peace. Clara stepped closer, slowly, each step a battle inside herself. She sat in the chair by the bed, her tear-filled gaze dropping to the scar on her arm, where the faint outline of the swallow-shaped birthmark reminded her of where she had come from. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, her voice cracking, tears sliding hot over her cheeks like rain falling on parched earth. "But I'll try." The words weren't a promise, only a door left ajar, a fragile hope she offered to herself and to him. Nathaniel looked at her, a faint dying light igniting in his eyes like a candle flickering in a breeze. "Thank you, Lillian," he whispered, clutching the photograph as if it were the last thread tying him to the past. His breath came ragged, his eyes slowly closing, as if her words had given him the final peace he needed. Clara stayed there, her tearful gaze fixed on him, her hand resting on his, feeling the warmth slowly fade away. She didn't know if the old wounds would ever truly heal, but in that moment, she felt a delicate connection to the man before her. Not the love of a family, but the understanding between two people who had lost so much. When Clara left the hospital room, the weak sunlight touched her face, catching the tears still clinging there. She walked down the corridor, her steps somehow lighter, even though her heart was still heavy. The steady beeping of the machines echoed behind her, blending with the sound of her footsteps, a sad song of the past. She wasn't sure if she would ever fully forgive, but the promise to try felt like a small flame, quietly burning in her heart, leading her through the storm of memories and sorrow, toward a future where she might finally find peace. The media storm grew fiercer by the day, like an invisible monster roaring to devour every bit of light along Clara's path. The tabloids' hungry vultures picked apart and twisted the truth with screaming headlines splashed across cheap paper: "Fraud masquerading as the Grant Heiress," and "Clara, an accomplice, exploits sick old man." The articles accused Clara and Adrian of taking advantage of Nathaniel in his frail, clouded state, forging DNA results to steal the Grant family fortune. Every printed word felt like a cold blade, slicing not only into Clara's reputation, but also reopening the deepest scars in her heart. Behind this storm were the same relatives, led by Evelyn, the woman with elaborately styled platinum hair and eyes sharp as a knife. Her mocking smile, cold as ice, hid a bottomless greed. They spread venomous rumors like poison, determined to drag Clara's name through the mud to protect the share of the inheritance they saw as their untouchable right. Clara walked down the street toward the diner, the dim streetlights casting her lonely shadow on the wet pavement. Every step felt as if it were weighed down with lead, the whole world pressing on her shoulders. She felt the curious stares of passers-by, heard the whispers from regulars and strangers alike. It was like walking through a field of thorns, every thorn carrying a whispered accusation. One morning, while she was clearing tables, her hand froze mid-wipe as a regular, an elderly man with thick glasses, lifted a tabloid and said with a mocking, almost curious tone, "Clara, you're the city's new star. They say you're a master con artist." Clara looked up, forcing her familiar wry smile. Her lips curved, but her eyes remained hollow. "If I were that talented, I'd have bought this place and retired to some island by now, wouldn't I?" She replied lightly, but with an edge that made the old man chuckle. But when she turned away, her smile vanished completely. Her brown eyes darkened with a pain she tried so hard to keep hidden. Every murmur, every suspicious glance was like an invisible blade slicing into her heart, already covered in scars from all the lonely years in the orphanage. In her cramped rented room, Clara curled up on her bed, the glow of the street lamp shining through the thin curtain to fall across the scar on her left arm, where the tiny swallow-shaped birthmark seemed to whisper of a past she still didn't fully understand. She hugged her arm, her fingers brushing the scar, feeling like she was touching the broken pieces of herself. "Who am I?" she murmured, her voice so small it nearly dissolved into the dark. The rumors and lies didn't just hurt her, they awakened her deepest fear, that she truly didn't belong anywhere, that the world was determined to shove her back into the loneliness she'd fought so hard to escape. Adrian couldn't sit by and watch the injustice. His anger burned like a flame, not just because of the Grant family's cruelty, but because of how they dared to trample on Clara, the woman with the resilient smile and the big heart, the woman who had made him believe life was still worth fighting for. He arranged a press conference at an elegant hotel, where crystal chandeliers shone over cream-colored walls, and photographers' flashes burst like a storm. Standing before the microphones in a charcoal gray suit that hugged his frame, Adrian faced the crowd, his gaze as sharp as a blade, but burning with pain and determination. "Clara is Lillian Grant," he declared, his voice ringing out like thunder, strong and unyielding, drowning out every whisper in the room. The DNA results were confirmed by 3 independent laboratories. Every document slandering her is a forgery. If anyone wants to challenge that, they can face me. He dropped a thick folder onto the table, proof that Evelyn and the other relatives had paid to have the papers forged, complete with emails and recordings of their conversations. The slap of the folder hitting the table sounded like a verdict, sending a wave of shocked murmurs through the room. Adrian stood there like a wall of steel, not just protecting Clara, but declaring war on the storm that tried to consume her. In those turbulent days, Adrian never left Clara's side, even as she tried to hide her pain behind her humor and that wry smile. One evening, while a light rain fell outside the diner windows, Clara sat alone on a wooden bench behind the counter. The pale moonlight shone through the glass, highlighting the scar on her arm. She hugged her knees, her eyes distant, as if she were drowning in an ocean of tangled thoughts. Adrian came in, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with rain, but his eyes were warm, a small flame against the cold night. He sat beside her without a word and simply held out a handkerchief, the clean scent of the fabric a quiet comfort. Clara looked at him, forcing a small, crooked smile. "You don't have to play babysitter, Adrian. I'm fine." But when a single tear slipped down her cheek, she turned away quickly, not wanting him to see the weakness she'd spent a lifetime hiding. Adrian gently touched her hand, his thumb brushing the tear away, a warmth that made her heart tremble. "You don't have to hide, Clara," he said, his voice low but steady, a promise he would never break. "Not with me." His words were like warm air, slipping through the cracks in her defenses, melting the ice she'd built around herself. Clara slowly reached out and took his hand, her slender fingers trembling but warm as they closed around his, as if clinging to an anchor in the storm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft it nearly vanished beneath the patter of rain. "I'm not used to having someone here." Adrian smiled, gentle but full of quiet strength, his heart aching for this small, brave woman. He tightened his grip, as if to tell her he wasn't going anywhere, that he would be her steady ground, no matter how the world outside fell apart. They sat together under the moonlight, the only sounds the rain and their quiet breathing, merging into an unspoken song. Between them, something took root, a small flame flickering in the darkness, fragile but warm enough to chase away the chill of these blackest days. In that moment, Clara felt a spark of hope flare to life in her chest, not hope for a past already lost, but for a future where, at last, she wouldn't have to fight alone. The pale light from the hospital window filtered through the thin curtain, spreading across the cold white walls and the bed where Nathaniel lay. The steady beeping of the medical equipment pulsed through the room like the artificial heartbeat of a machine, in stark contrast to the frail body that remained a shadow of the man who had once ruled over the Grant family. On the small table beside the bed lay the will the lawyer had just completed according to Nathaniel's last wishes, leaving everything he owned to Clara, the daughter he had only just found again after 20 years. Nathaniel knew this decision would ignite the fury of his family, but he no longer cared. To him, this was the only way to make amends for the mistakes that had stolen his daughter's family from her. Clara stood in the doorway, her hands tightly clasped, nails digging into her palms as if she could somehow steady the trembling of her heart. She wore a dark blue sweater, her brown hair tied low, and the scar on her left arm showed in the weak light, like a reminder of the years she'd lived without a name. Adrian stood beside her, his gaze gentle but resolute, a silent promise that she wouldn't have to face this moment alone. Nathaniel looked up at the sound of footsteps, his clouded eyes brightening with a fragile flicker of hope when he saw Clara. "Lillian?" he called, his voice weak and quivering like the last gust of autumn wind. Clara stepped closer to the bed, every step feeling as though she were dragging an invisible boulder. She sat down in the chair beside him, her gaze drifting over Nathaniel's lined face, his hollow cheeks, his red-rimmed eyes filled with guilt and love. He reached out, his thin, trembling hand closing around hers, cold but warm with desperation. "I had the lawyer draw up the will," he whispered, his voice breaking as though each word cost him the last scraps of his breath. "Everything I have, it's yours, Lillian." He paused, struggling for air, then turned to look at Adrian, his eyes pleading. "Adrian, promise me, you'll protect her." Adrian nodded, his voice low but unwavering. "I promise, Nathaniel." He squeezed Clara's hand tighter, as if willing her his strength. Clara felt her chest tighten, the pressure almost unbearable. When she looked into Nathaniel's eyes, she didn't see the man she had hated in her imagination. She saw a father undone, imprisoned by his own regret. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he went on, tears slipping down his weathered cheeks and soaking the pillow beneath his head. "Lillian, if you can, forgive me." His voice cracked, dissolving into a final plea, full of pain and hope. Clara went still. She had hated him once, hated the invisible father who had abandoned her, hated the fate that had stolen her family. But now, looking at Nathaniel so frail, his eyes red with sorrow, his hand clutching hers, the hatred dissolved, like fog in the sunlight. In its place rose an unnamed ache, a deep sorrow for all the years they had never been able to share. Her tears spilled over, hot against her skin. She nodded, her throat too tight to form words. "Dad," she began, but her voice broke, and she could only squeeze his hand in return. Nathaniel smiled, a weak, peaceful smile, as if her nod was the final gift he had been waiting for. "Thank you, Lillian," he whispered, his eyes slowly drifting shut. His breathing grew shallow, then stopped. The beeping of the machine turned into one long, cold note. Clara sat motionless, her hand still gripping his, tears falling onto the back of his thin, lifeless hand. Adrian stepped forward and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything, just stood there quietly beside her, a silent anchor in the middle of the storm. You're watching Soul Stories exclusive to our channel. If you're still with us, drop a comment. We read and cherish them all. Subscribe to support more heartfelt, original stories. Thanks for being part of the Soul Stories family. Nathaniel's death left a cold emptiness in Clara's heart, as if a part of her had been torn away, exposing wounds that had never truly healed. The Grant mansion, with its moss-covered stone walls and long, silent corridors, was no longer just a house. It was a symbol of a painful past and a hostile future. Nathaniel's will, granting his entire vast estate to Clara, was like a spark thrown onto dry grass, igniting the fury of the family. The relatives, led by Evelyn with her platinum hair and blade-sharp eyes, looked at Clara as if she were an intruder daring to steal what they believed was rightfully theirs. Every stare, every venomous whisper was an invisible dagger plunging into her scarred heart. The family meeting took place in the grand living room, where the crystal chandelier's light shone down on portraits of ancestors, as if they, too, were silently judging from above. Clara sat at the end of the long walnut table, her hands clasped tightly over her dark blue sweater, the scar on her left arm visible a silent declaration of everything she had survived. Evelyn rose, her voice as sharp as a blade. "Who do you think you are, Clara? Some orphan girl who dares to sit here and claim an inheritance? You don't belong here." The other relatives nodded, their eyes gleaming with greed and resentment, like a pack of wolves ready to tear her apart. Clara felt her chest tighten, her heart beating so hard it felt as if it would break free. She stood, her legs trembling slightly but her gaze steady, bright with a resolve nothing could shake. "I don't want this fortune," she said, her voice calm but carrying through the room, as if she were making a vow from the deepest part of her soul. "I'm establishing a charitable foundation in my mother's name, Margaret, to help children who grew up in orphanages, like I once did. That's what my mother would have wanted, and that's what I choose to do." Silence fell, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Evelyn's mouth dropped open, her face paling, her eyes wide with shock and rage. The other relatives glanced at one another, bewildered, unable to comprehend that the girl they'd branded an opportunist was turning down a fortune the whole world would covet. Clara stood there, small but radiant, like a flame burning bright in the darkness. From the corner of the room, Adrian watched her with eyes full of pride and quiet awe. He saw in her not just resilience, but a heart vast enough to turn her pain into light for others. He stepped to her side, his gaze warm, as if to say, "You are never alone." In the months that followed, Clara and Adrian worked together to build the Margaret Foundation. The days passed in a blur of tense meetings, visits to orphanages, and long hours ensuring every dollar went toward bringing smiles to children with no families. One evening, beneath the sunset at a children's center, Clara sat among a group of little ones, telling stories in her playful voice, making them laugh and cling to her as if she were an older sister. Her smile then was brighter than it had ever been, not a shield to hide the hurt, but a light shining from a heart that had finally found its purpose. From a distance, Adrian watched her, his heart full as he took in the sight of the woman who had transformed her scars into hope for others. One night, they sat together on a wooden bench in a small park near the center, the silver moonlight making the scar on Clara's arm shimmer. Adrian gently took her hand, his warm fingers weaving through hers as if holding her entire world in his grasp. Clara looked at him, her brown eyes shining with tears, but this time, not from pain, but from a peace she'd never known before. "For the first time, I feel like I belong somewhere," she whispered, her voice trembling, full of emotion, as if her heart were finally opening after all those years locked away. Adrian squeezed her hand, his smile tender as moonlight, carrying a silent promise that he would always be there. Under the moon and the soft hush of the wind, Clara felt a small flame ignite in her chest, not the fire of anger or grief, but the warmth of love, hope, and forgiveness. She had chosen her own path not to run from the past, but to transform it into a light that could guide other lost souls. And on that journey, she knew with certainty she was no longer alone. 1 year after Nathaniel's death, the Margaret Foundation had become a brilliant flame, lighting up the lives of hundreds of lost and orphaned children. Born from a small idea in Clara's scarred heart, the foundation had grown into a vast network of support shelters rising across the city, family reunification programs, bringing hope to souls who had once been swallowed by darkness. More than 300 children had found homes, over 100 families had been reunited, and dozens of free classrooms had opened their doors, where children who once wandered the streets now sat in neat rows, their eyes sparkling with faith in the future. The same newspapers that had once painted Clara as a fraud now published glowing articles, calling her a flame of hope and a hero for lost souls. But for Clara, fame was fleeting. What made her heart beat faster was the clear laughter of the children when she stepped into a center, the tight hug of a little girl who had just found her mother, the light in the eyes of children who had once believed they would always be alone. Each smile was a medicine that healed wounds she thought would never close. The first anniversary of the Foundation's work was celebrated in a wide garden where wildflowers bloomed under the early summer sun. White tents were set up, bright with paper garlands and balloons of every color. Children from all the centers ran and played, their laughter mixing with cheerful music from small speakers. Clara stood in the middle of it all, wearing a simple pale blue dress, her brown hair loose around her shoulders, the scar on her left arm showing like a badge of strength. She smiled as she talked to each child, fixed a ribbon in a little girl's hair, listened patiently to a boy excitedly describe his dream of becoming a pilot. From a distance, Adrian watched her, his gaze tender and full of pride, looking at Clara as if she were his whole world. He saw not just a resilient woman, but an indestructible flame, transforming pain into light for others. Over the past year, the love between Clara and Adrian had blossomed like the wildflowers in that garden, fierce, romantic, and deep. Together, they had weathered every storm, from the relentless rumors spread by the Grant family to the long nights spent working side by side, planning the future of the Margaret Foundation. Every touch, every glance carried a quiet understanding, as if their souls had merged, sharing both scars and hope. Adrian, with his steady, gentle presence, had become Clara's anchor, standing by her through the loneliest moments. And Clara, with her radiant smile and open heart, was an endless inspiration to him, proof that life, even when filled with pain, was still worth loving. They were not just partners, they were two perfect pieces of a puzzle, painting a love story where every brushstroke was soaked in feeling. That afternoon, as the blazing sunset bathed the garden in gold, Clara found an old wooden box in the Foundation's temporary office, where she and Adrian were sorting through keepsakes from the Grant mansion. Inside was a letter, written in Nathaniel's trembling hand, as if he had poured the last of his strength into each line. Lillian, my beloved daughter, forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it will free your future. I live my life in regret, but knowing you are alive, knowing you are as strong as your mother, I have finally found peace. I love you, Lillian, even if I never deserved your love. Your father, Nathaniel. Clara sat still, the letter shaking in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. But this time, her tears didn't carry pain or loss. They were a release, as if a door inside her heart had finally swung open, freeing the burden she'd carried for so long. She remembered that final moment with Nathaniel, his thin hand clasping hers, his eyes full of guilt, but also overflowing with love. She had promised she would try to forgive, and now reading his words, she knew she had succeeded. Forgiveness was not just a gift she had given Nathaniel, it was a gift she had given herself, so her heart could finally fly free. When she looked up, Adrian was standing before her, his eyes gleaming in the sunset, reflecting the burning sky. He knelt down in front of her, in the middle of that garden filled with children's laughter, and pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple silver ring, shining like a tiny star in his palm. Clara, he said, his voice warm and a little unsteady with emotion, I've seen how strong you are, how much you love, and I know that for the rest of my life, I just want to be by your side to build dreams together, to keep bringing light into the world. Clara, will you marry me? Clara felt her heart stop and then burst into a warm, powerful flame. Her tears shimmered, but her smile was brighter than ever, like sunlight breaking through the clouds. Yes, Adrian, she whispered, her voice choked with joy. Yes, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger, over the scar and the swallow-shaped birthmark that told the story of her journey. They embraced as children clapped and cheered all around them, as if the whole world was celebrating. Their wedding was held in that same garden a few months later, under the brilliant summer sun. Clara walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, her brown hair falling loosely around her face, the scar on her arm no longer something to hide, but a testament to her strength and forgiveness. Adrian stood waiting in a pale gray suit, his eyes lighting up when he saw her, as if she were the entire universe. When they spoke their vows, the children of the Margaret Foundation stood in a circle, tossing handfuls of wildflowers that fell like tiny stars on the grass. In that moment, as Clara and Adrian held each other's hands, they silently thought of Nathaniel. Clara remembered him, the letter, the late but sincere love he had given her. She felt as if he were smiling somewhere beyond, finally at peace knowing his daughter had found happiness. Adrian thought of his old friend, the man who had entrusted Clara to him, and he knew he had kept that promise, not only to protect her, but to love her with all his heart. Both of them felt a deep, quiet fulfillment, as if the long, painful journey had led them to this perfect place where love and forgiveness had washed away every shadow of the past. Clara looked at Adrian, her eyes shining with joy and peace. "For the first time," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I truly feel like I belong." Adrian squeezed her hand, his smile warm as sunlight. "And you always will, Clara here, with me, forever." Under the golden sun and the laughter of children, their new life began no longer clouded by the darkness of the past, but guided by the light of love, forgiveness, and dreams finally fulfilled. Clara knew that though the scar on her arm remained, it was no longer a mark of pain. It was the emblem of a heart that had learned to love, to forgive, and to live fully.